All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. My name is Cassidy Westron. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here. Welcome to the List Visual Arts Center, and this is a graduate student talk with Jonathan Zong. This is a series where we invite graduate students and postdoc researchers to expand on our exhibitions using their expertise in a similar subject matter as a way to see how art and research are overlapping on MIT's campus. Tonight we'll be hearing from Jonathan Zong, a postdoctoral associate at MIT CSAIL and fellow at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and who will be an assistant professor in information science at University of Colorado Boulder in 2025. In his research, Jonathan partners with blind collaborators and study participants to co-design interfaces for non-visual data exploration. He also develops software and conceptual frameworks for managing the ethics of consent in large-scale social media data collection. Jonathan's work has been recognized by the MIT Morningside Academy for Design Fellowship, the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans, and Forbes 30 Under 30 Scientists. In this talk, Jonathan will explore this central question. How do people say no when they're not given permission to say no? Feminists and indigenous scholars and activists have developed the concept of refusal as something that people with the least power in society can take up to challenge authority and open up new possibilities. Jonathan will discuss his research on data refusal as design, how people work to reshape systems of large-scale data collection. Zong will draw connections between this work and Kite's artistic and scholarly engagement with the Lakota ontologies and Indigenous AI. At the end, we'll have a Q&A where you'll have a chance to ask any questions you may have, and that is it. So thank you so much for being here and showing interest in our programming. And I'll hand it off now to Jonathan.
All right, thank you so much, Cassidy, for that introduction, and thank you, to you and the list for having me here tonight. So the goal of my talk today is to, introduce some of my work on the idea of data refusal and put it in conversation with the work that you see here by the artist Kite, who is a Lakota artist and scholar, multi-talented visual artist, performer, composer, also a professor at Bard College. And it's my hope that, kind of hearing about some of my work will help you see some of these works in a new way and have interesting conversations around them. So my work engages with the idea of data refusal. And I'll kind of break this talk apart into maybe like 3 parts. First, I'll kind of introduce the idea of refusal and kind of talk about where that idea comes from. Then I'll kind of go deeper into my work on the idea of refusal as, an act of design and how it kind of contributes to design and computer science and the creation of technology. And then lastly, third, I will kind of draw connections between my work and the work by Kite that you see around you, and then we'll open the conversation for Q&A from there. So first, what is refusal? As Cassidy kind of suggested, I think about refusal as this idea of saying no without being given permission to say no. And it's kind of like an intentionally broad concept. It's a way of describing a category of thing that people do. And the reason we have a concept that's intentionally this broad is because it describes actions that people take in a lot of different situations, in a lot of different areas of society. And we think about refusal in the context of data, right? When we talk about data, we're talking about something that's very ubiquitous. It's information about people that's automatically collected and then used in a lot of different areas that are inputs into decisions that have a lot of important social consequences. So whether that's data about you that goes into your credit score, or some kind of like pretrial risk assessment algorithm, or any other number of systems. Because data touches so many areas of life, the situations that people find themselves in when they are practicing refusal against data are very varied. So we're thinking about things like, there was like a family who tried to hide their pregnancy from e-commerce like ad targeting algorithms, and they had to do things like use cache and be careful about what they typed into Google and things like that. There's examples of advocacy organizations like organizing people into class action lawsuits against governments and companies for using racially biased facial recognition algorithms in services or policing. And there's even direct forms of refusal, like protesters in Hong Kong kind of taking saws and chopping down lampposts because they might have surveillance cameras in them. So even though these various actions kind of all look different from each other, some are things that individuals do, some are kind of organized legal actions, some are maybe illegal actions. The idea of refusal kind of helps us see these different concepts as part of the same phenomenon or like same kind of movement in society. And so refusal is an idea that comes from scholarship and thinking from feminist and indigenous scholars. And I'll talk a bit about what it means to kind of like name those as like the conversations that we're starting from, right? So if we think about consent maybe as an example of like a conversation that feminist scholars have found very important in recent years, right? The idea that for consent to be freely given, like being able to say no without coercion or any kind of outside influence, right, is really important. And I think that feminist perspective of thinking about power when it comes to decisions and consent kind of informs ideas of refusal, where sometimes companies who like are asking for our data, give us an opt-out button or like either agree to the terms and conditions or just like don't use this thing, right? And those aren't like kind of equally weighted options. So kind of a feminist analysis of power helps us see like, maybe all the choices on the table are bad, and refusal kind of turns into a way of not just saying yes or no to an option that's presented to you, but even kind of questioning, why aren't other alternatives on the table, and questioning like the legitimacy and authority of people who are offering us these constrained choices, right? And a lot of conversations around refusal have kind of happened in the context of ideas around biological citizenship, which is really important to indigenous scholars who are thinking about, what makes someone a citizen of a sovereign nation, and what happens when kind of external governments and forces try to like impose a way of identifying you based on things like your genetic ancestry that might not align with like the way that you see yourself or like the kind of social reality of like the communities that you live in, right? So I'll give an example of one maybe inspiring instance of refusal that I think exemplifies a way that refusal can be a thing that like not just says no to a thing in the present, but also kind of suggests alternate future possibilities, right? So there's a kind of movement called Indigenous Data Sovereignty, and one of the organizations that's been kind of leading this movement is called the First Nations Information Governance Center. And the story of that center is that there were First Nations groups in Canada that had been kind of systematically left out of health surveys that were conducted by the Canadian government. And while these were sovereign nations, and the Canadian government wasn't necessarily thinking of them in the way that they were thinking of themselves, but they also kind of felt the effects of being left out, right? No data about them meant that they maybe weren't getting as good like access to resources that were being allocated on the basis of this data, right? So they ended up kind of doing a bottom-up, like community-led development process of like an alternate regional health survey that was like made by and for First Nations people, and then kind of taking that to the Canadian government and saying like, this is kind of the data that we want to be understood by. And so refusal in this sense was saying no to one kind of existing way of working, but also kind of proposing an alternative. And this kind of ties into like the reason I think this serves as an inspiration for my work is that much of what I've been thinking about is kind of the idea of data refusal as an act of design, right? So I work in a computer science department. We're always thinking about designing technology, right? Making decisions about how technology should work, what kinds of inputs should go into technology, and where it should be deployed in the world, right? I think conventionally, computer scientists think of like technology non-use as like a form of deprivation, right? Or a lack of access. So the assumption maybe is that if people are not using the thing that we built, we just need to make our thing better, and then people will then use it, like once it's more usable, right? Or user-friendly. And that kind of starts from an assumption that like the thing that we decided to build is like a thing that people want in the first place. And so I think something that's interesting about refusal from the context of this conversation about technology design is that refusal is a way for people who have kind of historically not been part of these conversations about what technology should be designed, how it should be designed, how it should be used in the first place, to kind of have a say, right? And we can look at acts of refusal like people kind of avoiding the use of certain technologies or trying to get them banned through the law as kind of responses to one version of like a set of relationships between technology and society that's being advanced. And maybe behind that refusal, there's like the seed of kind of an alternative, right? Refusal is always kind of implicitly about, we would rather not have this, we would rather have something else. And even if we don't know what that something else is, I think considering refusal as like a kind of legitimate way of engaging with technology kind of helps us see those instances where our current technologies are maybe insufficient, or helps us see kind of the unequal power relations that go into the development of technology. Because Kite's work weaves together her scholarly and artistic background so well, I think there's a lot of ways that I see my work and hers as potentially being in conversation. I first learned about Kite's work kind of on the scholarly side of her work, where she has done a lot of writing around how Lakota ways of thinking and ontologies and kind of perspectives around how people relate to materials and like other non-human entities, how all of that can kind of like inform practices of design, right? So she has this essay called "How to Design Anything Ethically," or something like that, and it's kind of taking the perspective of what can we learn from she as a Lakota citizen is really kind of engaging with like her community's cultural practices, and she kind of walks through this example of like the process and the thought that goes into designing a Lakota sweat lodge, and kind of breaks down that process into a framework that might apply to the design of other things. So she kind of uses that as a template for kind of thinking about what would be a starting point for trying to design AI more ethically. And I guess a lot of her work kind of deals with this idea of process and protocol, right? And she describes protocol as decisions and actions that kind of define relationships between humans and non-humans. She talks about the stars and the stones, the local and the global, and she's kind of thinking about the way that the way that we decide how to do things kind of affects the outcomes that are created, right? And I think, even though she might not explicitly use the word design all the time, I think this is very resonant with the way that I'm thinking about, refusal as design, refusal as kind of part of a process of, society kind of collectively coming to terms with, decisions about what technology should be. And, in the gallery here, I can talk a bit about the centerpiece of this show, which is a piece called Dreamlike Star. And it's kind of a multi-part, like there's this film aspect, there's a kind of flat sculpture on the ground made of stone, and there's this like graphical component that's on the wall. And the piece is about, Kite worked with a Lakota designer, visual artist to create what they call a shape kit. So a set of kind of icons, shapes that serve as like a visual vocabulary. And she used that to translate 3 months of her dreams into a visual score that then kind of informs a performance that takes place between a performer and a set of instructions that are on the wall. So you can kind of see how the idea of protocol is taking shape in this piece where a performer is kind of following a score, which is a set of instructions, maybe kind of behaving in a machine-like way. And she, in her performance, has like sensors, and she has this kind of like braid of hair that she created that's also a musical instrument with kind of like machine learning models that she like trained herself that kind of map her movements and the movements of the braid into like musical output. And I think the engagement with materials like her own hair or the stones that we see here, I see as kind of like important to her engagement with her Lakota background, right? She describes computers as like melted stones that are mined from the earth. And I think this attention to material kind of echoes like some other conversations that are happening too in conversations about like the sustainability of AI. And there's like a big lithium mine in Nevada that powers a lot of AI systems that's kind of built on the ancestral land of indigenous peoples, and the kind of way that we think about AI as something that's kind of like abstract and maybe disembodied, but it's really something that is being created and is from resources that are from the earth and is situated in a place and is kind of altering the relationship that we have with these materials, right? Yeah, I think when I think about her work, I see this kind of concern with like the context and like the place in which things are happening, and I think about the idea that refusals are always kind of situated in a context and responding to things that are like maybe happening in specific communities and specific cultures, and as a result, right, like no two responses that people will have even to the same type of data system will look the same. But I think attending to that kind of specificity is actually an important way that we kind of push back against the way that we are often encouraged to think about AI as like removed from our kind of surrounding environments and ecologies and communities. So I think I'll wrap it up there and open it up for questions. But thank you for coming to this talk, and I hope you enjoyed.